Okay, class, welcome back to research. We are going to look at statistics at this portion. Once researchers collect data, okay, so they've used their methods and collected the data, they now need to know how to explain the data. So we've looked at the scientific method, okay, and we've talked about asking a question, stating a hypothesis, writing an operational definition, gathering the information. Now we're looking at the crunching part. Once you get all this data, how do you actually analyze it? Okay, so first look at the two types of data you could have, quantitative and qualitative. Quantitative data is looking at the data in numbers, graphs, or maybe it's presented in stats. Quantitative, it's looking at the number. All right, so I just got your quiz scores back and I found out the majority of you ended up getting a 70%. Okay, that's looking at the number. Qualitative is maybe looking particularly at the questions that you got wrong. So the majority of the questions that you got wrong were looking at independent and dependent variables, or you got questions wrong that were dealing with hindsight bias. All right, so now that we know the type of data we're looking at, most of it's going to be descriptive or that quantitative, looking at numbers. Okay, it's now we're going to use stats, and statistics is when you take the data and it computes it into smaller terms. For example, it's putting it into percentages, or it's breaking it down to make it smaller, more manageable. All right. You have seen information, or you've worked with central tendency before. Central tendency is when you're getting a single number to represent the entire body of scores. Okay, you have mean, median, and mode. Let's take a first look at median. Median is the midpoint, a measure of central tendency that represents by the score that separates the upper from the lower. Okay, it is looking at the middle number of all the scores. So if I had all my scores right here, okay, the first thing I'm going to do is probably put the scores from lowest to highest. Then I'm going to find the midpoint, or the median, right? And in this case, it would be 70. All right. It's minimally affected by the extremes. Okay. If there was 90 here, that wouldn't really affect it. Okay, because it's usually looking at the midpoint of the majority of the scores. Okay? The big advantage here is the median is not affected by extreme scores. All right. You then have the mode, a measure of central tendency which represents the scores which happens most often or more often. Mode. Okay, for our example here, 68, 70, 70, 75, 65, or 72. Okay, you know that it would be 70 because that's the number that's most often. All right, then mean means the average, the measure of central tendency most often used. All right, it takes into effect all the data, which could be bad or could be good. Okay, which means outliers can skew the data. All right, most students received a 70 on the quiz score, so the 90s can skew it. Okay, to calculate it, simply add all the scores and divide by the number of scores. So our example there is 68, 70, 75, 65, 72, divided by 5. You add them all up, would be 70. Okay. So once you kind of understand the mean, median, and mode, you should understand the range on a graph. Okay, the range is going to be where you subtract the highest number from the lowest number. In our case, with our numbers, it'd be 75 divided by 65, and my range of data would be about a 10. Okay. You're then going to be able to find the standard deviation. Standard deviation is how far your number, your quiz score, actually deviates from the mean. So how far is your number off from the mean? Standard deviation is a computed score to measure how much scores vary around the mean score. Standard deviation is a calculation where they look at the mean and individual scores. Okay, the standard deviation is going to tell you how far you are off from the mean. How far did you deviate? Did you stray from the path? The mean, the range, and individual scores are calculated. You do not need to know how to do this. Okay? You just need to know what standard deviation actually means and kind of be able to apply it to a scenario. All right, so for example, the average on the test was a 10. The standard deviation is often a number that represents a larger body. Okay, we calculated the standard deviation I did for our little example, and what I found out was you receive 1 deviation for every 10 points. So I did my calculation. All right. Here's our mean, all right, which is 70%. All right. When you're deviating one deviation away from the mean, okay, it's about a 60, which would be 10 points. When you go to 50, it would be 2 standard deviation. When you go to 40, it would be 3 deviations from the mean. Okay? And obviously the other way as well. Right? The larger the standard deviation here, so here's our larger deviation. If it was really spread out, the more spread out it would be. Okay? If things are more spread out, things are more deviated from the mean, that might reveal that the test, a lot of students are getting a lot of different answers here. Okay? Smaller deviation, the closer the scores are together. The littler the spread may be. Okay, maybe the more consistent the test may be. Okay, or maybe some students are just missing a couple questions. Could be. All right. Often you will not be asked to calculate the standard deviation, but apply what you know about the concept. It is used to explain how much the numbers vary from one another. Knowing the standard deviation can tell you how similar the scores are. Right? Like I said, the higher the score, the higher the deviation, the more variety the scores. Lower the variability, the lower maybe the variety of the scores. Here's an example of something you may see. For example, which of the following sets of data has the greatest standard deviation? 10, 5, 17, 50, 5, all the way up to 18, and 90 to 95. So stop. How can you figure this out? If you look at the spread, you can start making an assumption. The larger the deviation, okay, 5 all the way up to 50, is a large range. Larger deviation, which would be A. Okay, less spread out, 90 to 95 is going to have a smaller deviation, which would be C. Okay, smaller deviation. You should also be familiar with the normal distribution curve, okay, which produces a bell-shaped curve. This would mean that 50% of the data, okay, is 50% of the scores are above the mean and 50% are below to have a normal distribution curve. Okay. If it's not normal, all right, it could be skewed between these two. You should know the difference between positively skewed and negatively skewed. Positively skewed distribution is most scores are below the mean. All right, so they're below, and where you have a little few outliers on the right side, which is known as the tail. Negatively skewed is where they're above the mean. All right, most scores are above the mean, and then you have a couple skewed, all right, below the mean. Okay, so maybe jot this down, maybe draw the picture, the difference between positively and negatively. Right. Moving on now to inferential statistics. Inferential statistics different from descriptive statistics because descriptive statistics is looking at that number. Inferential now is it involves estimating what is happening in the same population for the purpose of making decisions about that population. So once you get the data back, now you can start kind of assuming if it worked for that population, it might work for the rest. Okay? However, there's always chance of error. Statistical significance is when you're going to look at two sample groups and you notice that something's not due to chance. The difference is instead likely due to the difference maybe between the samples. Okay, not maybe the way that the experiment is set up. Data is significant when the experiment was ran over and over and over again and it was consistent. In other words, it's statistically significant. It means that the data you're getting back is significant, it's consistent, it's the same, and maybe there's only 5%, right, that's not the same. If less than 5% is wrong, it would be considered statistically significant. Okay, so this is your review on statistics. I would make sure that you're pretty comfortable with this terminology and how to apply it. I will give you some sample questions tomorrow in class.